Parable number 10, The Merchant of Other People's Opinions, on Mana and Borrowed Conviction. A merchant in a great city was famous for the certainty of his opinions. He had an opinion on every matter. He had an opinion on the weather, the war, the price of wheat, the morals of the young, the failure of the old, the conduct of the king, the conduct of the king's enemies, the conduct of the king's wife, and even the conduct of the gods. He delivered each opinion in the same firm voice, looking the listener in the eye, and few who heard him doubted that he had thought through the opinion himself. But he had not. He had begun in his 20s as a young man who had observed that the city paid well for confident speech. He had been a quick study. He had listened in his first few years to the men whom the city listened to most. The senators, the bishops, the rich merchants, and the famous scholars. He had memorized their opinions. He had filed them. He had by his 30s accumulated several thousand, and he filed them in his mind by topic, on the weather, on the war, on the price of wheat, and so on. And he learned by the same study which audiences wanted which opinions. The Tuesday afternoon crowd at the corner of the linen market wanted one set. The Saturday afternoon drinkers at the inn by the river wanted another.
Yeah.
The bishop's reception wanted a third. He had no goods. Other merchants carried in their carts cloth or grain or oil or wine. He carried in a small leather sachet a notebook in which he kept in fine handwriting his catalogue of opinions. He referred to it at home in the evenings when he prepared for the next day's audiences. He had a remarkable memory. He rarely needed the notebooks in public. He spoke at markets. He spoke at receptions. He spoke at funerals. He was paid in coin by other merchants who wanted him to give the appearance of convictions at their tables. He was paid in respect by officials who wanted to be seen agreeing with a confident man. He was paid in welcome at houses he had no claim to enter. He grew rich. He grew well dressed. He grew by his 50th year into one of the city's most familiar figures. He had never, in his 50 years, given an opinion that was his own. Now, this was, in some sense, his most carefully guarded secret. He had not, even to himself, fully admitted it. He had told himself in his middle years that the opinions he had memorized had become his, that in long use a borrowed coat becomes a coat of the wearer. He had told himself that the city, in paying him, was paying for the service of consolidation, that he had read so widely and listened so carefully that his synthesis was, in effect, original. He had told himself many things. One day, at the linen market, at the corner where he gave his Tuesday afternoon performance, small child in the back of the crowd raised her hand. She was perhaps 7 years old. She had come with her mother, who was buying linen. She had been listening with concentrated attention of children to the merchant's opinion on the war. The merchant had been delivering, at that moment, the opinion of the city's most respected general, refined slightly through the lens of the city's most respected bishop, with a small flourish borrowed from a famous senator who had been dead for 10 years. "Sir," said the child. The crowd parted the letter to be seen. "But what do you think?" she said. The merchant smiled the practiced smile. He had been asked this before. He had a practiced answer. The practiced answer was an opinion of his own opinion, borrowed from a philosopher who had written on the subject of personal opinions. He opened his mouth to begin, but nothing came out. He tried again. He moved his lips. He produced a sound, but the sound was not a word. He produced another sound. After a long pause, a small puff of fine grey dust, which drifted out of his mouth and settled on the cobbles in front of him. The crowd stared. He tried a third time. More dust. The dust was the colour of paper that had been burned long ago. There was a great deal of it. It came out of his mouth in a steady, soft stream. He couldn't stop it. He could not, in fact, produce anything else. The opinions, when he reached for them in his mind, came up as dust. The notebook, when he took it out of his satchel, was full of dust between the papers. The handwriting was visible, but the ink was, somehow, also dust. The child waited. The merchant could not answer. The child watched him for a few more minutes. The dust continued. She looked at last at her mother, who looked away. She looked back at her mother. They left the market with their linen. The merchant stood at the corner all afternoon. Crowd dispersed, twos and threes, as crowds do when a performance has gone wrong. By evening, he was alone at the corner. The dust had settled in a small ring around his feet. He gathered it slowly into a handkerchief. He took it home. He did not, in the years that follow, recover his career. He had, in the dust, lost the access to his catalogue. The opinions remained in his mind. He could still recite them, in fact, but he could not, after the day of the child, deliver them in his old voice. The voice had been the thing that had made them sound like his. The voice had, in the dust, become unavailable. He sold his fine clothes. He took a small room in a poor quarter. He found work in time as a corrector of other people's manuscripts, a job he was good at, because he could recognise in any sentence the opinion behind it. He recognised them all. He had somewhere in his mind the catalogue. He spent the last 20 years of his life this way. In his old age, occasionally, in a quiet hour, a small opinion of his own would arrive. It would be modest. It would be about something small. The colour of a particular type of bread, the temperament of his landlady's cat, the way that the light fell through the window of his small room on October afternoons. He would speak it aloud to himself. The opinion would not, in his mouth, become dust. It would simply hang in the air for a moment and then be over. He came to value these small opinions more than he had ever valued the many borrowed ones. He died at 73 in a small room with a small notebook beside the bed in which he had written over the last 20 years, perhaps 200 sentences. The sentences had been his own. The notebook was buried with him. The child, who became a woman, never knew the consequences of her question. She married. She had her own children. She heard occasionally the name of the merchant in conversation among old men in the years after his decline. And she never connected it with the man at the corner of the linen market where she had been 7. She had just simply forgotten. But the city, after the merchant, was slightly different. The officials who had paid him in respect found in his absence that their own opinions had grown soft from disuse. The merchants who had paid him in coin found their tables harder to fill with the appearance of conviction. The city had to learn slowly to do its own opinion giving. It did so, reluctantly, and not always well. But the small child's question, repeated occasionally by other children in other corners, became a kind of phrase the city used in moments of pretension. What do you think? It became in time the most uncomfortable question in the city. It is, in some cities, still the most uncomfortable question. Moral. The man who carries other men's opinions has no opinions of his own. When asked what he thinks, dust comes out. The dust is the only honest thing in him. He may, in the years after the dust, find small opinions of his own. They will be about modest things. He will value them more than the many he borrowed. The work, late in life, is to write them down.
Yeah.
The notebook can be buried with you. The question, what do you think, survives.